Then it held one quite gently but reassuringly in place. It was possible to stir and turn over, but the feeling of being held fast was very comforting. With a little care about what one thought of before going to sleep, one could get a refreshing 8 hours' rest. The bunks were luxury. Sally said, "The date and time's a secret, of course, because it might be overheard, but there'll be another ship up before too long. It's bringing landing rockets for you to come back with." "That's good," said Joe. "It would feel good to set foot on solid ground again." He looked at Sally and said eagerly, "We've got a date the evening I get back?" "We've got a date," she said, nodding. But it couldn't very well be a definite date. There were people with ideas that ran counter to plans for Joe to get back to Earth and a date with Sally Holt. The space platform was not admired uniformly by all the nations of the Earth. The United States had built it because the United Nations couldn't, and one of the attractions of the idea had been that once it got out to space and was armed, peace must reign upon Earth because it could smack down anybody who made war. The trouble was that it wasn't armed well enough. 6 guided missiles couldn't defend it indefinitely. It looked as helpless as isolated Berlin did before the first airlift proved what men and planes could do in the way of transport. And the platform's enemies didn't intend for it to be saved by a rocket lift. They would try to smash it before such a lift could get started. A week after Joe got to it with the guided missiles, 3 rockets attacked. They went up from somewhere in the middle of the Pacific. One blew up 250 miles below the platform. Another detonated 190 miles away. For safety's sake, the third was crashed, at the cost of 1 guided missile, when it had come within 50 miles. The screen of tin cans worked, but it wasn't thick enough. The occupants of the platform went about hunting for sheet metal that could be spared. They pulled out minor partitions here and there, and went out on the surface and threw away thousands of small, glittering scraps of metal in all directions. 2 weeks later, there was another attack. It could be calculated that Joe couldn't have carried up more than 6 guided missiles. There might be as few as 2 of them left. So 8 rockets came up together, and the first of them went off 400 miles from the platform. Only one got as close as 200 miles. No guided missiles were expended in defense. The platform's enemies tried once more. This time, the rockets arched up above the platform's orbit and dived on the satellite from above. There were 2 of them. They went off at 180 and 270 miles from the platform. Joe's trash screen would not work on Earth, but in space it was an adequate defense against anything equipped with proximity fuses. It could be assumed that in a full-scale space war, nuts, bolts, rusty nails, and beer bottle caps would become essential military equipment. 3 days after this last attack, a second supply ship took off from Earth. Lieutenant Commander Brown was a passenger. Its start was just like the one Joe's ship had made. Push-pots lifted it, JATOs hurled it on, and then the furious, flaming takeoff rockets drove it valiantly out toward the stars. Joe's ship had been moved out of the landing dock and was moored against the platform's hull. The second ship made contact in 2 hours and 17 minutes from takeoff. It arrived with its own landing rockets intact, and it brought a set of 40-foot metal tubes for Joe's ship to get back to Earth with. But those landing rockets and Lieutenant Commander Brown constituted all its payload. It couldn't bring up anything else. And Lieutenant Commander Brown called a very formal meeting in the huge living space at the platform's center. He stood up grandly in full uniform, and had to hook his feet around a chair leg to keep from floating absurdly in mid-air. This detracted slightly from the dignity of his stance, but not from the official voice with which he read 2 documents aloud. The first paper detached Lieutenant Commander Brown from his regular naval duties, and assigned him pro tem to service with the Space Exploration Project. The second was an order directing him to take command and assume direction of the space platform. Having read his orders, he cleared his throat and said cordially, "I am honored to serve here with you. Frankly, I expect to learn much from you, and I have very few orders to give. I expect merely to exercise such authority as experience at sea has taught me is necessary for a tight and happy ship. I trust this will be the one." He beamed. Nobody was impressed. It was perfectly obvious that he'd simply been sent up to acquire experience in space for later naval use, and that he'd been placed in command because it was unthinkable that he serve under anyone without official rank and authority. And he quite honestly believed that his coming, with experience in command, was a blessing to the platform. In fact, there was no danger that this commander of the platform would crack up under stress as Sanford had. But it was too bad that he hadn't brought some long-range guided missiles with him. Joe's ship had brought up 20 tons of cargo and 20 tons of landing rockets. The second ship brought up 20 tons of landing rockets for Joe and 20 tons of landing rockets for itself. That was all. The second trip out to the space platform was a rescue mission and nothing else. Arithmetic wouldn't let it be anything else. And there couldn't be any idea of noble self-sacrifice and staying out at the platform either, because only 4 ships like Joe's had been begun, and only 2 were even near completion. Joe's had taken off the instant it was finished. The second had done the same. The second pair of spaceships wouldn't be ready for 2 months or more. The ships that could be used had to be used. So, only 36 hours after the arrival of the second rocket ship at the platform, the 2 of them took off together to return to Earth. Joe's ship left the airlock first. Sanford was loaded in the cabin of the other ship as cargo. Captain Commander Brown stayed out at the platform to replace him. Obviously, in order to get back to Earth, they headed away from it in fleet formation. They pointed their rounded noses toward the Milky Way. The upward course was an application of the principle that made the screen of tin cans and oddments remain about the platform. Each of those small objects had had the platform's own velocity and orbit. Thrown away from it, the centers of their orbits changed. In theory, the center of the platform's orbit was the center of Earth, but the centers of the orbits of the thrown-away objects were pushed a few miles, 20, 50, 100, away from the center of Earth. The returning spaceships also had the orbit and speed of the platform. They wanted to shift the centers of their orbits by nearly 4,000 miles, so that at one point they would just barely graze the Earth's atmosphere, lose some speed to it, and then bounce out to empty space again before they melted. Cooled off, they'd make another grazing bounce. After 8 such bounces, they'd stay in the air, and the stubby fins would give them a sort of gliding angle and controllability, while the landing rockets would let them down to solid ground, or so it was hoped. Meanwhile, they headed out instead of in toward Earth. They went out on their steering rockets only, using the liquid fuel that had not been needed for course correction on the way out. At 4,000 miles up, the force of gravity is just 1/4 of that at the Earth's surface. It still exists, it is merely cancelled out in an orbit. The ships could move outward at less cost in fuel than they could move in. So they went out and out on parallel courses, and the platform dwindled behind them. Night flowed below until the hull of the artificial satellite shone brightly against a background of seemingly sheer nothingness. The twilight zone of Earth's shadow reached the platform. It glowed redly, glowed crimson, glowed the deepest possible color that could be seen, and winked out. The ships climbed on, using their tiny steering rockets. Nothing happened. The ships drew away from each other for safety. They were 50, then 60 miles apart. One glowed red and vanished in the shadow of the Earth. The other was extinguished in the same way. Then they went hurtling through the blackness of the night side of Earth. Microwaves from the ground played upon them. Radar, used by friend and foe